Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to session 2 and day 2 of the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum on Disinformation and the Future of Democracy. We're delighted to kick off our panel now, looking at harnessing the social sciences and the humanities to think about disinformation and online extremism. I'm going to kick it back to my colleague, Professor Ona Hathaway at the law school, to introduce our panel in just a moment. As a reminder, if you're tuning in online, you can submit your questions using the Q&A chat feature. And of course, we will incorporate those as we go. These have been really interactive sessions, and we've been thriving off of that feedback with both the in-person and virtual audience. So thank you very much. We're recording the video as well for the benefit of everyone, which we'll share after the fact. And back to you, Ona.
Thanks so much, Ted. It's great to be here. So as Ted mentioned, today we're talking about disinformation and the future of democracy. We had a great morning talking about detecting deep fakes and coordinated inauthentic behavior that got us started. And now we're turning to the question of harnessing the social sciences and humanities to counter disinformation and online extremism. As we talked about briefly this morning, although when we planned this event, we hadn't intended to focus on the current events in Ukraine, seeing current events in Ukraine and the kind of horrific events unfolding there, does raise the question of the role of disinformation in combating and how combating disinformation can help protect democracy. And at least our sense is that there's been more success in combating disinformation in the current crisis than in the past. So there's a timely element to this as well, and I imagine we'll get to some of that in the conversation today. So I just want to give a brief introduction to our panelists. If I read all of their qualifications, we'd spend the entire panel just talking about their bios. So I'm going to keep this brief. We have Elliot Paul. Her main research interests are in metaphysics, cognitive science, and the philosophy of the mind. She's the Millstone Family Professor of Philosophy and Cognitive Science here at Yale Law School. And she explores questions about the nature of the self, decision-making, temporal experience, philosophical methodology, causation, and perception, neurology, constitution, and essence, which she'll have to explain to all of us, and certainly to me at least. She also leads the New Self and Society initiative under the auspices of Yale's Wu Tsai Institute, which focuses on bringing together scientists with those who work in philosophy, law, and economics to understand the societal implications of advances in neuroscience. We have Jason Stanley, who is the Jacob Urowsky Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. His latest book is How Fascism Works, unfortunately, extraordinarily timely topic. And prior to that, How Propaganda Works. His current research project, which I think you've just finished. Yeah, just finished, but not yet out. Not yet out, but soon to be, hopefully soon to be out. On non-ideal philosophy of language called The Politics of Language, co-authored with David Beaver, is forthcoming this year. Molly Crockett is the Associate Professor of Psychology at Yale University and a Distinguished Research Fellow at the Oxford Center for Neuroethics. She also directs the Crockett Lab, which investigates how people learn and make decisions in social situations. The lab's recent studies have applied these insights towards understanding moral cognition in the digital age and across different types of social relationships. And then our moderator for the panel today is Asha Rangappa, who's a director of admissions and senior lecturer in global affairs at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs here at Yale Law School. Prior to her current position, she was at Yale Law School, where she was my colleague, and we were really thrilled to have her there. And before that, she served as special agent in the New York division of the FBI, specializing in counterintelligence investigations. If she looks familiar to you and you're online, it's because you've seen her on your television, because she's regularly on TV commenting on various issues of national importance and national security matters. So we're so thrilled to have you all here today. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you, Asha.
Yep. There you go.
Okay. Thank you all for being on the panel. I'm excited for this panel because I think that the topic of disinformation often gets really focused on the technology or the platforms. And I think we fail to see sometimes that it's cross-disciplinary and how those disciplines intersect with the technology. So you guys are perfect for this. I want to dive in. I'm going to just ask a question for each of you, but if you have follow-up, just let me know and just jump in. So I'm going to start with you, Jason. And so my question to you is first, can you explain the link between disinformation and fascism? And in particular, it's obvious that authoritarians use disinformation as a means of control. And what I think is really paradoxical is that when you have when you have the internet, the social media explosion, which is incredibly democratizing and which creates more information, you would think that that would be something that would be a threat to authoritarians. And yet it's been weaponized to actually help the growth of far-right movements and authoritarian movements around the world. So discuss.
Okay. Oh my God, I can't do this technology. Oh, it's working.
He's a philosopher.
Oh my God. What happened?
Let go.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much. I'm really honored to be on this panel. I'm a great admirer of all three of these people. Asha and I in particular have been in kind of nonstop discussion for the last 4 or 5 years. And without her help really on these issues and being sounding boards for each other, I couldn't have done the work I've done. Goebbels made sure, the Nazi propaganda minister, that there was a radio in every house in Germany. This was non-accidental. What is the relationship between disinformation and and fascism and the global fascist movement we're seeing right now? So this goes back to an issue that is it the racism or is it the lying? Like, wow, they seem to be sort of two sides of the same coin. Because here's a huge lie. The Hindus are the greatest people on earth. White people are the greatest people on earth. Russians are the greatest people on earth. That's a lie. That's disinformation. So the racism and the lying, they're two sides of the same coin. I hate the word disinformation. It's really a terrible word. It's not the problem we face. The problem we face is this kind of social identity connection, this kind of Carl Schmitt point, the theorists of fascism, that you create a nation by choosing an enemy. You create a nation by choosing an enemy. And that's what we're seeing again and again. We're seeing networks used as they were all throughout history to highlight salient atrocities. To highlight, Russia says there's a genocide in Eastern Ukraine of Russians. There's no such genocide. So, but you have individual things like the Rohingya ethnic cleansing. There was a rape of a ranking woman by 3 Rohingya in 2012, and then there was 5 years of what we call disinformation. So it's highlighting out of context crimes, say, and then creating a social identity, creating a nation, creating a fascist social and political movement by unifying people against that entity. And the reason it's called disinformation, it's just because it's computationally and algorithmically easier to pick out the false things. But hey, you, as the Rohingya ethnic cleansing and genocide showed in Myanmar, you can create an ethnic cleansing and a genocide just with one true incident. You can say, look, this actually happened. So it's not disinformation at all. It's social identity formation by vilification.
I really like social identity formation by vilification, and that's consistent with many decades of research in social psychology, which is my home field. And the moralized nature of vilification, hate speech, and propaganda is why we started building tools in my lab for being able to track expressions of moral outrage on social media at large scale. And in fact, what we found recently is if you look at the coincidence of hate speech across a variety of topics and expressions of moral outrage, they overlap more than 75% of the time on average. This is, a feature of, I think, a lot of the, fascist movements that have gained a lot of traction online, because in other work we've shown that moralized information, in particular moral outrage, is more likely to go viral online. It gets more engagement, it spreads further, it spreads faster. And so you get the design of social media that really rewards and spreads engaging content. And it turns out the kind of content that is most conducive to the rise of fascist movements is exactly the type of information that, inadvertently, but unfortunately, these platforms are designed to amplify.
So on that point, I'm wondering, there was the MIT study that showed that, false posts travel 6 times faster on social media, and that anger is the primary driver of that. But I think that same study also showed that the second biggest emotion that drives virality is, I think it was awe or like inspiration, like things that uplift us. And to the point of moral outrage and kind of group identity, I feel like we're seeing this online now with Ukraine. There's actually moral outrage against Russia. In other words, it's being harnessed now towards, it is being harnessed towards an enemy or an adversary, but also around certain collective human values. So why can't we do that more often? Like, why does it take, somebody, a psychopath threatening to decimate an entire country for us to be like, oh, and what is, is it simply that it's visible? Like, I think in many ways, I'm interested to hear your thoughts. I feel like Zelensky and the Ukrainians, maybe because they've been so close to Russia, know how to play this game, right? They're like, whoop, you got the video of the grandma with the sunflower seeds and, people driving the tanks or giving gas to, or, offering to drive them back to Russia. So, is there a deliberate thing there that is helping to promote this, or how would we do this organically?
Could I add to Asha's comments? And this is, I love your work, but I also have a criticism of it, which is that it plays into a kind of faux neutrality. I worry that it plays into a faux neutrality. Like, when there's fascism, there's going to be a lot of moral outrage. My Twitter feed is filled with moral outrage by me. We need moral outrage, and we need moral outrage in the face of fascism. And I'm not sure that I worry your side comment. I think the tech companies are fully complicitous, and it isn't inadvertent at all. But so how do we get away from, it's true that moral outrage drives likes and retweets, and it's true that moral outrage, that's why Putin creates fake claims of genocide. But it's also true that this is an extreme time, and anti-fascism requires an extreme response filled with moral outrage.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and also just picking up on what Asha said, moral outrage itself is not inherently good or bad. It depends on the target, and likewise, the tendency of social media platforms to amplify moral outrage is inherently neither good or bad. It depends on the outcomes. There's some data suggesting that for reasons that are as yet not well understood, so far it looks like moral outrage on the right gets a bigger boost from social media algorithms than moral outrage on the left. That's a really coarse distinction and an imperfect one, but the studies that have looked at this so far, for example, comparing Democratic and Republican social media posts over the past few years have shown that the right is amplified more than the left. So that's,
Well,
concerning.
The dominant group victimhood. So there are more people who are, the fascism is always the dominant group. And so it could just be a quantitative matter.
Yeah, that's probably correct. And I think also, looking at the intersection with disinformation, right? So, we also find in our research that news posts coming from websites associated with disinformation provoke more outrage than news posts coming from legitimate news sites. So it seems like, we see this across multiple social media platforms. It seems like there's evidence that, disinformation is perhaps engineered to evoke outrage, right? So then you have, groups that are more willing to use falsehood and spread disinformation via outrage are going to get a bigger boost than groups who are not willing to do that. So, and I think all of these forces are coming together to create these asymmetries that are concerning for the reasons that Jason mentioned.
So, Lori, so all this has been around since the beginning of time, right? Moral outrage, fascists using propaganda, vilification of outgroups. What is it about the intersection of what is it about the technology that changes how people respond or interact with that technology?
Okay, so
I know it's a big question. Describe your scholarship.
well, so I'm not going to directly answer your question.
Okay,
but,
please go to pivot to what makes sense.
Well, feel free to press me if you think. So in everything that I'm hearing Molly and Jason talk about, I keep thinking, yes, there's an element of history repeats itself. That's an old cliche, but it's also the case that we face radically new unknowns. A lot of my work involves radical unknowns. I work on transformative experience, which might have positive connotations in some contexts, but what it really means is that there are possible radical new changes, the nature of which we don't understand until we're actually immersed in the change, and they change us as a community, as individuals, and at the world. So there's a sense in which radical new events which come upon the world fairly regularly kind of shift the ground underneath our feet. And some of the work I do involves computation and structuring how to think about decision models and processes of decision that we should use to try to face this kind of radical change. And it's a serious
and when you say
problem.
radical change, do you mean like the pandemic type of thing, or do you mean technology, or all of the above?
I mean it all. So,
Okay.
So for example, with technology, we had radical new changes when the internet was created. Actually, when smartphones were created, we face radical possibilities with AI development. In particular, I'm very interested in the way that we can't explain and understand decision-making by AIs in many contexts, even if we know what's going on at a very fundamental physical level. At the computational level, we don't know what's going on. And we need to also structure models so that humans in particular can understand what AIs do. And this is obviously super important in terms of like the military and a number of other places in the way that it structures our life. And so part of the problem here is that we can draw on history and what we know to try to face some of the problems, like with, for example, with war or the pandemic, or with just problems with like what AIs are doing. But there's another sense in which we have to, on the fly, develop responses. And that also requires us to have a measure of what I think of as epistemic humility. In other words, we need to recognize what we don't know just as much as we need to recognize what we do know. Because if we fail to recognize what we don't know, we will make mistakes. And I think this is then related to how to manage some of the new ways of thinking about moral outrage and so-called disinformation.
Is there a problem with just the time that you have, like with new technology, the saturation is so rapid? So, if you look at something like the radio, which took like, I don't know, I can't remember the exact number, but like several decades to saturate 75% of households where like everybody had one. Mm-hmm. And then, you have the TV, which is like more like faster. And then you have like, cell phones and the internet, which is, almost within, is it, that changes how well you can adapt, because That it's almost like it's just moving too fast for you to even understand the negative externalities of what's happening.
So, right. So that's absolutely relevant. When new technology comes on the scene, there's a period of adaptation, and the experts have an advantage. Okay. And the rest of us in a certain way have to follow suit. And so those that can exploit the unknowns and act flexibly in order to respond are going to have the leading edge, and they're going to be able to dominate and manipulate everyone else. And you see a lot of that now. And just when you were talking about being able to kind of exploit information in the right way, someone who can do that, who can understand how the ground is shifting and then have in a certain way, develop on the fly an algorithm or a function to kind of manipulate and manage that, they are going to have a huge advantage.
Not to be the old the old anti-tech person, but the Madison Square Gardens in 1923, I believe, was filled with, I think it was 17,000 people. My book has the exact number, with people. It was a rally. It was a rally to protest the Black Horror on the Rhine, which was Hitler's propaganda war that early Nazi party pushed, that Senegalese French soldiers in the Rhineland occupation were doing mass rapes of German women. So, a completely fictional thing in the early 1920s, which was before most of the internet, early before Facebook, just jammed Madison Square Gardens. So, and it was mostly just pamphlets by German Americans. So we are facing, this was my role in early propaganda conferences before they kicked me out and replaced me with tech people, to remind them that this is not just a problem that was recently discovered. Not that Lori was saying this, and Lori is rightly calling our attention to novelty, but the problem of propaganda is, as Asha said, book 8 of Plato's Republic. It's like Plato's arguing that that's why democracy ends, because people spread propaganda.
But isn't the problem that technology distorts that phenomenon, in the sense that those 17,000 people had to physically show up? Every one of those people is accountable. They're physically there. They're supporting this. You don't get to bring your whatever puff up doll, there to pretend, everybody has, some pretend, doll there that's making it artificially seem, because this is, I think, some of what, Molly, you talk about, is that it's the perception that there's a group that's supporting something that creates a self-feeding loop that then furthers that outrage. In other words, whereas in reality, it could be that only 2 people are really outraged about it, and the rest of them, are Igor and Boris in St. Petersburg, who are creating 1,000 fake personas.
Well, many people must have been outraged for 17,000 Americans to show up in Madison Square Gardens in the early 1920s to protest what was happening in the Rhineland.
1920s, the person who's sitting in Texas doesn't see the 17,000 people. And they aren't energized by those 17,000 people.
Yeah, and it can't spread through networks to reach your friends and your family, who are going to be more convincing and convinced by what appears to potentially be a collective belief that might actually not be grounded in reality. So there's a phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance, where individuals hold a private belief that they are worried is at odds with their perception of a collective belief. And so you have everyone essentially believing that everyone else believes something, is outraged about something, when privately they don't actually feel that way. And we found in our research that if you look on Twitter for people who are expressing outrage, and then you send them a direct message and say, hey, we saw you just tweeted this. On a scale of 1 to 7, how outraged are you? We get that data. And then we show those same tweets to a group of observers, and we say, on a scale of 1 to 7, how outraged do you think this person was?
Guilty.
And we consistently find a mismatch where the observers think that the authors are more outraged than those people actually report feeling.
Yeah.
And when we show those tweets to a further set of participants in experiments, we get them to scroll through a Twitter news feed that we simulate that consists of these over-perceived outrage tweets that further leads people to believe that it is appropriate to express outrage in the network and preferable to express outrage. People believe that the collective is more outraged. They believe that the collective hates the outgroup more. So you have all of these knock-on effects where you have a basic technology that amplifies outrage expression by rewarding it over time, and that then subsequently distorts collective beliefs about outrage.
And I just want to add, because exactly. And so then think about, so early in the 20th century, there was another kind of revolution, which was, you know, war photography became a thing. Okay, so being able to kind of present the information. And now obviously we're going to deal with that with deep fakes as well. In other words, these are transformative changes along with basically social media. And they can be exploited. And in particular, because the ways to exploit them they're new. And so first, there's a way we develop methods of exploitation that come out of nowhere in some sense. And then second, those that are extremely good at managing in a flexible way are going to have, again, like an exponential advantage.
Yeah.
Could I just say that, Molly, I've been to dozens and dozens of propaganda conferences, and the point you just made is the first time in my life I've ever been given a reason to think that the new technology matters to this problem, which is all the time the tweets sound more outraged than the people. But I also want to emphasize, for somebody who studies the history of propaganda and humans, like the distinctive thing about us is we kill each other in large numbers. And technology makes that easier in various ways. It is kind of hard to show why, it's really important to say this is not just a problem about technology.
So the history matters. I think the idea is to say that, look, we need to know history and we need to know background information. And then we also need to recognize there's a whole new component as well. That's the key.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just to Molly's point, I mean, I think in your work, like what's really fascinating is it's not even that the outrage might be overstating their feeling. It could just be not there at all, which in the, like I said, you just make it up and there's no accountability to the actual author, the person expressing it. Whereas the person, I mean, they could be faking it to go to Madison Square Garden, but at some level, in that face-to-face moment, they have to be, I mean, presumably they're cheering it on or something like that, in real time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I am really worried about the approach that all of society has taken to this problem, which is to elevate science, technocratic solutions, technocratic thinking as a way to deal with an ancient problem. And essentially, it's gotten much worse.
So on that point, because we've been talking a lot about the downsides, so how do we take the lessons of how these have been successfully countered, extremism, fascism in the past, in the analog age, and channel them or harness them or utilize technology to bring those to bear in the digital world? So, one example is like kind of what I was talking about before with the response to Russia, which kind of shows that you can take this the other way, though I don't know algorithms can actually differentiate between, good moral outrage versus bad moral outrage, which is a separate problem that maybe you can talk about.
Education can.
And I'm just curious, about, other resistance movements, like I'm thinking about the No campaign in Chile, which really unified people around, common positive values as a way of defeating dictatorship. Like that seems like something that technology should really be able to help people do. And so I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how, like now we've caught up, we know that the bad actors can weaponize this. We've had a little time to see like how this can go very, very bad. So what do we do to counter that?
Just because I have very strong feelings on this. So when I in 2017, one of the first propaganda conferences I went to was in February 2017, the Hoover Institute. And it was right after Trump was elected and the State Department put it on. And we were all in this room and the deputy head of the State Department was like, so we have to talk about the problem of propaganda. And everyone was like, you're Trump's State Department. You're actually the issue. What are we? And it was like super awkward because, and that's how I feel it is here. Like the tech companies are the enemy. Peter Thiel is like, the goal is not to be complicit in any of this. Like when the history is written, the power structures that, I think the important thing is to realize they only care about this insofar as it impacts their profits. And otherwise, academics are just window dressing, And so what's important for us as academics is not to be complicit in this authoritarian push, and somehow to negotiate capitalism.
Yeah, and I would just add that, it's convenient for folks like Peter Thiel, Zuckerberg, et cetera, that, well, technology has created this problem. There must be a technical solution. And the question I always get is like, oh, well, how could we redesign social media to like make this problem less there? And I never have a good answer for that because like, I don't think the problem is the technology per se, like the problem is us. And the technology, has certain effects on us, many of which we didn't anticipate. And it's a real conundrum.
I'll just add that I have deep concerns about the relationship between academia and the tech world, both because obviously there can be interrelationships that are problematic, but also because there's a bastion, I think, of intellectual thought that with, I think, the right kinds of commitments that's sort of free from, one might say, the influences of kind of capitalism that drive the tech industry. And that bastion is being eroded by the massive differential between resources, and I mean, not just monetary resources, but kind of data resources. There's a lot of work that's now becoming kind of protected and controlled by the tech industry. And so this is just a larger issue that I think is not receiving enough attention.
Absolutely. And as the lone scientist on the panel, I think I can say that we need the humanities to remain strong in the university because it is thinking and scholarship in the humanities that reminds us like where we've come from and where we need to go to deal with these problems that we're all facing. It's not like science is not enough to solve these problems.
So the purpose of my 2015 book, How Propaganda Works, and all of the proceeds go to charity, none go to my kids' college education, so I'm not hawking it for that reason. But the aim of it was to argue against dominant political philosophy that says that the main problem is the question of redistribution, was to argue that historically and philosophically, the main problem in democratic political philosophy is not how do we distribute resources, but the problem of propaganda. So I gave a historical argument from Plato to Hobbes to Du Bois and Dewey that the central objection to democracy was that you have free speech, and free speech will enable tyrants to spread hate speech and overthrow democracy, which is the point of Book 8 of Plato's Republic. And so I don't think that the problem. So if the problem seems hard, there's a reason it's hard. I think it's the central problem of democracy.
Sorry.
What was the question?
We have our own thoughts.
I'm wondering, like, what lessons, like, if technology is not the problem,
right?
And you said the problem is us, but the technology is here to stay.
Right.
The technology is changing us. There are a lot of unknowns with technology.
Right.
So we have to find a way to the extent that there have been solutions. I'm sorry, this is not.
You gotta pray. It's really hard.
It is really
Say something.
complicated.
I think your battery is off.
This panel brought to you by Google. So to repeat what I just said, okay, so I'm just going to recap some things here. Okay, so technology is not the problem. The problem is us.
Right.
We've been here before. But technology changes us, and there's a lot of things we don't know about technology. So I'm just kind of like piecing this all together to say, if we've combated this problem before, resisted, brought this balance, the force, back to the good side. How can we utilize the technology that is here to use those lessons, or to implement those same lessons? What are those lessons, and what can we do? How can that shape our understanding of what we do at this moment?
Let me start by saying something kind of general, because I think the two of you will have excellent explicit things to say. Some of this relates to decision theoretic rules that I think we need to establish. So one of the main problems, if you think of a situation where you can, like, say you're playing a chess game and you can map things out. So you've got a decision tree and you know all the different possibilities. Say you're an AI who can like hold all that, like represent all that in a relevant way. Then there's a way in which you have a model to proceed. The problem is when all the rules are changing as you play, right, on the fly, developing appropriate rules. And so what we need, I would say from my vantage point, is to develop ways of thinking that involve principles, like rules for rules. In other words, what stays fixed and what changes? And then how do we develop rules that build on what stays fixed to manage what changes? So certain kinds of, one might say, principles or heuristics.
And are those first principles values based? Like, are they, we maximize, democratic principles, or in other words, how are we creating those first principles?
So again, let's go back to the chess game, right? So what you need to follow procedures, but you assign values to different moves and values to different outcomes. And then what you want to do very roughly is identify the best way to get from point A to point B that's going to maximize your value. Okay. So the same kind of thinking needs to apply here. So values matter just in the sense of how we value things or disvalue them. And then also the moral rules that we use, that all of that matters. But then think about something like climate change. That's another transformative change that's coming upon us. We need a principle to use, like that's kind of a principle of principles. And so some people have developed things, like John Quiggin at Queensland University has developed what he calls the precautionary principle. Well, he's endorsed and developed like heuristics for as applied to climate change. And we need to have a kind of a clear-headed way then of adopting particular high-level principles that are going to guide us, but then we also obviously need to know the details. So.
Yeah. And I want to hear what you have to say, but just to throw this in there too, is it possible to create those principles pure, like with machine learning? So I'm thinking again of the moral outrage issue, right? Like, I know when I see a police officer engaging in brutality, that the outrage I feel there is different than, people who feel, outraged because of some like government Russian propaganda of genocide or something like that. And so, in other words, how do you incorporate into that? Can you take the human level out of it? Because there's a discernment there. There's a moral discernment that is I don't know. Is it programmable? I don't know.
Okay. So Asha, I didn't answer your question because if I'm right about political philosophy, you just asked, tell me all about democratic political philosophy. The very purpose of democratic political philosophy is to educate people so they don't fall for disinformation, for hateful disinformation. That is all the way back to, if that's the point of my 2015 book, to argue so when you had political philosophy focusing on redistribution, philosophy of education started to drop out of philosophy departments because people forgot why philosophy of education was so central. The reason philosophy of education is so central, and the reason education systems are always at the center of fascist movements and attack on fascist movements, is because the traditional response to hate speech is give people an education so that they understand what they're facing, and give people empathy and create a democratic culture. So the question you're asking is, how do you create a democratic culture? And what fascists do, what we're seeing that's why we've got the anti-CRT bills, the attack on education here. That's why when Putin says denazification, what he means is going to rip out democratic education from the schools. He's going to put in what we see in Hungary, what we see all over these countries, indoctrination. And so that's why education is the classic democratic response to what we see. And the entire structure of political philosophy, democratic political philosophy, dating back for thousands of years, is how do you create a democratic culture? And a democratic culture makes people resistant to propaganda.
Anything to add before I open it up to questions? Ted, what time does this panel go till?
We still have like an hour and a half.
30 minutes. Should I continue discussion or open up for questions and then come back to, yeah, let's open up for questions.
You want me to help you, Asha?
No, I think I can got it. Isha?
We have some online ones too, so we can alternate.
Okay, so tell me when you want to jump
Yeah.
in online.
So, and just briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Isha. I'm a senior at Yale College majoring in global affairs. I actually took Professor Rangappa's class on Russian disinformation in the fall. And one of the topics that we talked about was this idea of like a public town square. Professor Stanley, you mentioned that you don't believe that like the tech companies are something that like it's what's the new problem, and like it's sort of been something that's been happening for a while. In that concept, it's almost like when someone is discussing propaganda or disinformation, like a public town square, there's like physical boundaries as to who can hear it and who can't. And your response in terms of like education is like one of the best ways to sort of mitigate a lot of these harms. I would agree, but I'm curious in terms of accountability, who should we be looking at as like who's responsible for a lot of this? And when we do look at ways to combat this moving forward with technology moving forward, is education the best way to do it? Should we be looking at other recommendations as well?
Or can I just add, Isha, are you also suggesting like maybe it's the tech company's responsibility to incorporate some?
Yeah,
mechanism
exactly.
of
And sort of
civic-
like this idea of moral outrage that we've talked about, like tech companies, like things go viral on these platforms. So if I wasn't in that specific like event, I would then subsequently hear about it because it went viral on Twitter or it went viral on Facebook or like Instagram or whatever. Happy to clarify the question as well.
So I'm a mere humble descriptive theorist and would never make prescriptions, but you know, what you're asking about is the problem of free speech. The tech companies, I don't think no one's going to hold them accountable. These are tech oligarchical authoritarians, and they're bigger than governments, and it's kind of fantasy to think we can hold them accountable. We have to think of some way. That is a novel structure that we have to deal with. Lori's absolutely right on that one. But there is a very, very long history of philosophical discussions of free speech. And there's two basic outlines here. One is to do what every Western democracy other than America does, and Eastern, India has hate speech laws too. First Amendment, India's First Amendment bans hate speech and mentions Plato. So it didn't work in India, but so there's hate speech laws, and then there's a kind of civil libertarian response that you can find in, say, Judith Butler's Excitable Speech, where she says banning speech won't help the problem. As she predicts in 1997, she said, banning racist speech, I bet that will end up in banning anti-white racist speech, anti-white speech, supposedly anti-white speech, and she turned out to be right. So there's a good reason to be suspicious of speech bans, and there's a sort of Judith Butler in her amazing work, Excitable Speech, argues that, you know, you kind of have to have a mass speech movement that counters it, and that's not to fall into the idiotic, the best idea will always win. It's to recognize that the people who actually profit from hate speech often control the structures, and so you need to think through a different response, a collective response, and that's what Butler pushes for.
Yeah, I would just add to that on the question of accountability and social media platforms. You know, thus far they have managed to successfully argue that, oh, we're just a neutral platform. You know, we're not creating content, we're just hosting it. And Section 230 of the something that I can't remember, that one, yes. basically, enshrines this into law that you can't hold a platform accountable because they're not playing an editorial role the way that a newspaper would, let's say. I think that our research and others' recent work calls this assumption into question, because we can show at the level of the individual user that the content of posts changes over time as a function of the incentives that the platforms deliver. So the line between like, oh, we're just neutral hosts for this content and we're like creating content, there's a gray area in between that I think we are definitely in, where you can't credibly argue in the face of all this data that is here now, that like the platforms aren't influencing the content. They clearly are.
It's reinforcement learning.
And I mean, the Facebook papers kind of drive this point home, right? So your research shows that moral outrage sort of builds, and we learned that there was a period of time where Facebook was prioritizing that angry engagement over things that people actually had positive responses to. So to your point.
Just briefly, that I think it is very important to recognize that tech companies have their own goals, and there's just no way, I think, to require the tech companies to kind of police themselves. We know that from all, and there's an extra thing, which is partly it's about known ways in which people might need to police themselves, but also it's just very true that we don't have control of a lot of the computation, a lot of the algorithms in place. It's just a fact that there's a lot of this that even the engineers don't understand. And it's an evolving problem and process. And so there's a way in which that gives, people license to say, well, sorry, we didn't know, which I think is, utter bullshit. It's more like you need to recognize the possibility that, like, look, you don't know, and they do know that they don't know. And there's a kind of responsibility that needs to be defined and attached to that.
Yeah, and it's really interesting as you're saying this, because I mean, in a lot of other industries, in the law, we have like a strict liability principle, like car manufacturers, like, they can't be like, oh, I didn't know that you needed brakes. I mean, they're responsible for the safety of their product. And then we have this entire, it's this new sphere where we kind of let this happen.
Yes.
Of like, well.
Also, a lot of what we call disinformation is true. So the amplification of isolated things. There are immigrants who have done terrible murders. So a lot of the, if you look at, I don't have the facts to hand because I'm a humanist, but I've been to conferences where there are people who have lots and lots of facts. And one set of facts that jumps out again and again is that when you are pushing people to immediate political violence, atrocity, revenge is the main thing that you push for, like revenge narratives. So you show them some terrible thing. And so if we're going to, and many of the times the revenge narratives are true, there is some particular horrible incident, that there were some ethnic Germans in Poland who were beaten and killed, but it didn't motivate Germany's Nazi invasion of Poland, So if we're punishing, we're talking about accountability. It's complicated because it's not just a spread of falsehoods. It's the magnification of things that
And it's the narrative that's created.
It's the narrative that's created.
It's the narrative.
Molly
right?
years ago ran into me on the street. It's like, wait, do you have a definition of narrative? Because that's really important.
Other questions or?
Yes. In the way.
Hi, I'm Talia Weiss. I'm a physics PhD student here. I had a question that really follows up on the last one and relates to the relationship between academia and tech companies. So I recognize, as you have raised, that tech companies have different incentives, perhaps not in the public interest, focused on profit. But some of the other issues you've raised make me think that it could be very important for tech companies, for academia to build strong relationships with tech companies. In particular, when talking about education of the public against propaganda. We just heard right in the last session from someone at Google who is working on doing exactly that. And insofar as people are getting their education in part from social media, I wonder if there should be a coordinated effort to the extent possible to do that in academia, in tech companies, and if it's possible to also engage educators at a younger age in high school and even younger than that, what could be done there? And then the other related question I have is, Professor Paul, you brought up anticipation of radical changes and the information imbalance, how in particular, I think tech companies have so much data. And it seems very important to me for academics to have access to information quickly if there are changes occurring quickly, but that's hard to do if they don't have close relationships with tech companies. So I wanted to kind of push on and ask about this issue of complicity versus sort of some of the practical benefits of engaging with tech companies and hear what you all had to say about that.
I can start, or we've had some really interesting experiences in a lot of different contexts, collaborating or interfacing is a better word with tech companies. So the question of access to data is super important and very contentious and evolving. And, some of you might recall several years ago, Facebook was much more open to sharing data with researchers. And then after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, in which it was discovered that researchers had basically harvested data from users without their consent and sold it to political campaigns in the US, Facebook basically shut down access to all data and then only kind of gave access through bespoke agreements where the tech companies had a lot of control. And there really just isn't a lot of good infrastructure for interfacing between academia and industry. Every time that I have interacted with Twitter or Facebook, I've had to sign NDAs. I got invited to be on a working group for the incentives team at Twitter, who's designing things like, reminders if you're about to retweet something without clicking on the link. Do you want to read this before sharing? I was really excited about this opportunity, but in order to participate, I had to sign a legal agreement, which I read the fine print, and it involved basically giving Twitter control over any research project in my lab that was related to anything we discussed during this working group, which essentially was my entire research program on social media, which I was not going to sign. And their lawyers were not willing to work with us to develop a new agreement. We have participated in an initiative called Social Science One, which was a project that I think was really, it had a lot of potential. And it was basically taking a consortium of academics and Facebook. Interfacing between them were Social Science Research Council, Hewlett Foundation, a few other nonprofits to basically provide funding to researchers to do research on aspects of Facebook data that were peer reviewed before we got access to the data. Facebook built a whole pipeline to create what's called differentially private data, so to preserve anonymity of users. And the project was just like delay after delay after delay. It was clear that Facebook, this wasn't a priority for them, because if it were, they would have put more engineers on the project. We learned after we had been working with the data for a year and a half that there was a coding error, which meant that we thought we were working with the data from all Facebook users, but it turned out it was only about 30% of users for whom you could estimate a political ideology, which is obviously like a really specific group of people. So, our experience with that has made it clear that there need to be, I think, like government regulated policies and structures for researchers to get access to data in an ethical way, so that we can, continue to look at these questions that impact all of us. Right now, the power is totally in the tech companies, and we're just sort of at their mercy, and it's been really hard.
So just to add to that, because everything that Molly has said is like super important, and really, I think, is an excellent answer to the question. So I just want to kind of follow up just to say that it's important to remember that what you don't want to set up is a situation where individual academic researchers are trying to negotiate with these companies. I think the protections for academics need to occur at the very least at the level of the university, and then ideally also at maybe a national, international level, like to follow up, because otherwise most of the information and power, like the power flow and information, it's all one way, right? And also, if you think about like humanities types, which I think very slowly, like I'm finding basically computer scientists and people working in particular on AI are recognizing that, oh, sometimes people from the humanities actually have a perspective that, they don't have and can provide unique information. But, talk about naive individuals when, when it comes to like, sorry, Jason, but,
Exactly. You're talking about us, not them. I thought you were talking about computer science.
But there's a kind of naivete that I think individual, in particular humanities people or researchers have, that's even, I think, more vulnerable to exploitation. So I think it's important to really try to not, it's just not a good faith kind of exchange in most cases. And there are real financial pressures for that.
I think it's often willful ignorance among the humanities people.
There's also that, this is
honest.
very complicated. There's
Right.
also willful ignorance and given that, and huge differences in resources, right? And the other thing is what I'm very concerned about is the proprietary nature of a lot of the research, like in particular, like Facebook and Google. I mean, you're seeing basically these tech companies coming in, hiring off basically like a lot of the most talented people coming out of the academy in various kinds of PhD programs. And that's something I think we need to be deeply concerned about as well. And it has to do with resource distribution.
Just very, very quickly on this, your question's about moral complicity. And, we're already at Yale, which is frankly not a democratic institution, an institution that no democracy should have. And tech companies are even worse on that. So we have to protect, Lori rightly called attention to the sort of need in a democracy for there to be a protected class of academics who can say what they want, who can do what they want from their research. Yale, because it's already an elitist, anti-democratic institution, is always going to fold into the tech companies. And so we as people in this institution have to protect the values that make academia central to a democracy. And
I just want to add one point. I know this is a humanities panel, but just to throw in like a little legal angle, the idea that the tech companies are complicit and their incentives are misaligned with the public good. I mean, we have dealt with this before, for example, with the tobacco industry.
right.
And we have placed the burden of care of both paying for some of the costs of the negative externalities that they create and also educating the public, they put labels on their products and tell people that it's harmful. I think either the tax or they are directly involved with anti-smoking education efforts. And so, there are ways of, I don't think we want to write them off and just say, well, they're never going to do it. There are ways of making these industries do things and to carry burdens, to create, tax incentives or, liabilities that encourage them to behave in different ways. That's a whole different panel, but I just thought I'd throw that out there.
And the opioid crisis.
Correct. Yeah. Ted.
And Una.
So a lot of reactions to this question of education. One respondent here says there's evidence from polarization research that more education can often lead people to engage in just the same or even more motivated reasoning for their existing beliefs as opposed to re-examining them. And
that's the motivated innumeracy paper by our colleague in the law school.
Okay, yeah. Well, so this did come up in the earlier session as well, where we were talking about how difficult it is to dissuade people who may already be on a path towards being susceptible to misinformation or extremist beliefs.
So all of this is covered in my class,
Yeah.
Propaganda, Ideology, Democracy.
Okay.
Read the motivated innumeracy stuff. We look at the objection to education, that it's just a method to defend your own priors. Here's the thing. what we're facing is the classic problem of propaganda for democracy. The only thing in thousands of years that people have come up for response is better education. Now, yes, people also use their education for nefarious, but I would say that, you know, right now, what we see with the Trumpist right is an attack on our education system. All across, all across the world, the first thing anti-democratic fascists do is attack the education system. And, you know, to strengthen the point by the questioner, the most cultured, educated, you know, best university system in the world was Germany in the 1920s, and it did not protect them. So, you know, these are the issues, and for anyone, and this is why it's the central question of democratic political philosophy.
Molly her research gets to something that could be a counter to that. Because Molly, your research also has this idea of, and there's other research that you transcend some of the group-based behavior when you have a supergroup identification.
I haven't worked on that, but that is a
maybe I'm thinking of another research. I feel like
in
could you explain what that is for folks who may not know? The super
yeah,
group?
so yeah, this is, you know, superordinate goals is you know, classic strategy for bringing groups in conflict together. And I mean, I don't know, I think there are lots of historical examples of this that you would know better than me, Jason. I would love for climate change to be a superordinate goal that could be leveraged to deal with some of these conflicts. I'm not super optimistic just because of the capture of, you know, public communication by industries that are just really intimately linked to energy industries.
So there's the classic discussion of the problem we're talking about, which is the formation of a common interest in a society, is Walter Lippmann's book, The Phantom Public, where he says the creation of a common interest is an impossibility. And John Dewey's response, the book, The Public and Its Problems, where he talks about the creation of a common interest. And what Dewey says is, of course, at a time, we don't have a common interest. But what we have to do is, in a democracy, we form society, and to respond to the person on the web, what Dewey called for is a reformation of education systems. So they're not just giving you facts, but education systems are there to train people to create common interests together. That's Dewey's solution.
We have another question here online. I want to get back to the audience.
Ona has a question.
Oh, it signaled to me to tell out the online questions. So this is an interesting question about the relationship between anonymity and democracy. And of course, this manifests online also. And that, you know, the question here is anonymity on the internet helping democracy? In that in certain places, of course, authoritarian regimes, right, it might be a mechanism for resistance, or allows you the freedom to say something you wouldn't feel comfortable saying otherwise, even in a democratic system. Yet at the same time, as we saw in the earlier panel, right, we have a tension here where the anonymity may also just be a gateway for misinformation or propaganda. So how do we get at this question? Do you think anonymity is a fundamental right in a democracy, or a fundamental right online? Or maybe Molly has some research in this area that could shed light.
I mean, it's, you know, as with many of the things we've talked about on this panel, like, it's complicated. You know, in some contexts, anonymity might be helpful. In other contexts, it's definitely harmful. So hard to make like a sweeping claim. I mean, I think there's a real just concern and alarming trend towards technology being used to take away our right to anonymity. Clearview AI is a company that started out as a really, you know, tiny startup and just began harvesting photos of faces from Facebook and other social media platforms directly violating the policies of the platforms to create a database of images that could be used to identify people from their face. And it's very concerning because the tech companies didn't do anything to stop this in the early days of this company. It's now working with police departments in the US and many other countries. It's growing. It has many millions of dollars in investment now, and like that's concerning. Have you heard of this company?
Now I have.
Yeah.
Clearview.
Yeah.
I'd heard of them, but I hadn't realized how bad it was. Yeah, that's horrible.
Mm-hmm.
This very example came up in our very first session, and it's complicated, right? Because the Clearview's data has been used to identify some of the January 6th insurrectionists, and so like on the one hand, this data is used, and on the other hand, it's used to get people who are to see. ICE has been using this for a while to seize people and deport them. So there's lots of complicated uses of this, but they just got another giant batch of data, so their capacity to identify all of us has gone through the roof, and this is a new future that we're all going to live in. It's gonna be very hard to be out in the world and not be anonymous and remain anonymous.
What's concerning about Clearview in particular is that the way the company describes its goals is not nuanced. It only really sells the upsides of the technology and has been really cagey about the downsides. And that's just a huge red flag.
But I want to get back just quickly because I haven't totally nailed it. The education question about more Dan Kahan's research about how motivated numerous are. More education can make you more ideological. This is the philosophy of education. The philosophy of education. What Kahan's mistake is to think that education means just knowing more facts. That's not what a democratic education is. A democratic education inures you to hate speech. It inures you to propaganda, hatred, and it does so by actively involving you in the creation of what Lori and Molly were talking about, common interests, common humanity. Dan Kahan shows that if you learn a lot of statistics, you can defend your ideological position on gun control, pro or against. That's irrelevant to what a true democratic education is.
Harold Coe used to say to the incoming students at Yale Law School, never let your skill exceed your virtue. And it kind of gets to that, education can make you more skillful and able to, engage in sophistry.
Right.
But you have to have the moral compass.
Well, that's
of
not
being guided by
that's
some
the wrong
virtuous principle.
I would say that's the wrong education. It's not a democratic education.
Well, you can see some of the people who come out of Yale Law School.
Right. Exactly. Well, yeah, right, exactly.
I just
We have
want-
about, oh, sorry.
But I just add one to the point about with Clearview, and with a lot of different, again, new kinds of technologies that come on the scene. Something that's really important is identifying the right level of analysis. So we're always going to find good things and bad things at certain levels of analysis. And so something that's really important to do is to target what's the right level, one might say, of valuing and of defining the events that we're going to value and disvalue. And then we need to use that and develop our principles about what we're going to do at that level. Otherwise, you get, again, like you end up in a place where you didn't expect to end, especially some of these lower levels. And things are changing constantly. That's exactly right. You're identifying. It's like, oh, well, look at these good things that Clearview can do. And then someone's like, well, there are these bad things as well. But then you don't have a way to you have to step above that and evaluate at a higher level to determine what the right policy is.
Let's get from the audience, I guess, on the side. Yep, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Claudia. I'm a senior in Yale College. Thank you so much for your time. I just wanted to ask, I do feel like even though propaganda is a problem as old as time, there is something fundamentally transformative about turning attention into currency and the ways in which attention has now become data, which then becomes currency and now has value, and also the ways in which it's immortalized and becomes permanent. And even if an explosive tweet lies dormant or is latent for a week, a month, it can always resurface. And so the nature of attention, outrage as memory, as permanent, as currency, as value is transformative in my opinion. And so I just love to hear how you think that relates to all of the things that we've talked about and how it changes some of the strategies we want to use.
I love that. That's so eloquently put. Really just a great summary of the problem. And one thing that got me into this line of work on outrage in the first place is that, you know, our moral brains evolved in a particular context where conflict and harm and, you know, speech was transient in a way that it is not in the context of online speech anymore. The permanence of many forms of online speech does create, I think, new problems that we didn't necessarily anticipate in ways that I worry can hinder our ability to learn and forgive. So in a world where a tweet that you sent 10 years ago and maybe deleted, but someone dug up to, you know, shame you for maybe strategic purposes, you know, that is a world that puts us more on guard. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. I think we're still figuring it out. But I do worry, especially in the case of young people who are figuring out, you know, how to be ethical in the world in a context that has very different consequences than before. You know, what are the long-term implications of that for our moral development as individuals and collectively? I don't think we know yet, but it's a question.
No. So let me just briefly get to follow up on Molly, because I think it is beautifully put. And one of the things that I just want to draw out from what you said is to think about one of the challenges with transformation is that before the transformative kind of process occurs, we have one way of valuing things. And then what happens is we undergo this process of transformation, and that changes how we value. And then combined with the fact that we don't know how it's going to change how we value until we actually are in the system, we have this kind of very, I think, difficult, more than difficult decision problem that we face.
Okay, so since two philosophers, three opinions, kind of like choose that way. I should say, I do agree the permanence is a difference, but since I wrote a book in 2015 arguing that the problem of democratic political philosophy for 2,000 years is exactly the situation we find ourselves in, that propaganda and hate speech end democracy, it's hard for me to see that. I mean, I agree the permanence is there, but, you know, if we the reason we have speech is to speak about politics in the public square. So what we face now is again the problem that every democracy in history has faced, and there's a new element.
But how do you want to address? I think you're right, but she's saying that also like a certain kind of a new thing, a kind of attention. So you're right that propaganda ties to attention in a very basic way that we've already known, but she's saying there's a new kind of attention almost. So.
The permanence is, okay. I think, the new aspect. I've never given an inch on this. This is new in my life, and this is the first time I've ever done that. And I'll give permanence, and I will give the point about people perceiving outrage more than. But again, we forgot about the weakness of democracy. And we're being reminded that democracies are few and far between, and we should treasure them.
We're running
On that
short
note.
here on time here. Yeah, Asha.
So, I mean, we don't have any more time. So thank you. I mean, this was an amazing discussion. I feel like we could take this in so many different threads. And I'm not sure that we necessarily ended on a super hopeful note, but you know, hopefully people will have lunch before they fling themselves out of a window. So no, but I think that what this tells us is that these are old problems in a new context, and that, you know, we're not like, you know, completely facing something, but that, you know, the unknowns, we need to work through them, but also use some of the things that we already know from how we've encountered this problem in the past to help solve it.
so much, everyone. The least we can do is give you a meal.
So it's a total